Hello once again from the Prim Reaper. Let us all sit around the fireplace while I tell you a tale of true terror. I was working on the next video in the Misuse of Words series when I received in my email the first document that I was to read for my upcoming degree. Wanting to be on top of things as much as possible in this one, I set about opening it right away. It appeared on its cover to be simply a book covering some basic details of professional writing. Nothing to be concerned about, or so I thought. But alas, dear viewer, little more than halfway down the introduction page do I come across the following passage. Model respect, professionalism, and socially responsible leadership in relationships with individuals and systems. Value respect and be responsive to cultural diversity. Conduct yourself in a professional manner across settings and situations. Take action to safeguard the welfare of others and to promote social justice.
Fuck this shit, I'm out. Fuck this shit, I'm out. No thanks. Don't mind me. I'ma just grab my stuff and leave. Excuse me, please.
Okay, dramatic reading aside, I really didn't think that I was going to encounter this quickly into my degree. I technically haven't even started the introductory course yet, let alone the actual first class. To see the literal words social justice appear so soon in what should be a totally unrelated text really makes me wonder how much of this degree is going to be actual useful content and how much of it is going to be SJW propaganda. Don't get me wrong, I'm not worried that I'm going to be taken in by it or anything. I'm just really rather bothered by the fact that I feel like I'm actively getting a crappier education than I would have gotten 10 to 20 years ago, just because we're wasting so much time wringing our wrists and walking on eggshells. Anyway, I had a strong suspicion that exactly this sort of thing was going to be coming up a lot once I started my degree, and as I have mentioned in the past, I felt like this would make good content for videos here. I feel like a lot of people might be interested to know what they're getting into these days, even when they're not studying something like women's studies or sociology in specific. So this series, which I'll be running along at the same time as I cover the misuse of words, will be known as the Hijacking of Higher Education. This first video will serve as an introduction, which seems appropriate as I've barely gotten into the first chapter of this new text and I already have several things to complain about. For ease of organization, I'll divide this particular video into 3 sections. These points follow from one another, and they may seem similar, but there is a different rationale between each of the points that I'm making. I'll try to explain what I mean. Number 1. Legitimate concerns versus silly nitpicking. I think that it's best that we first acknowledge that there is a certain level of reasonable professionalism and respect for others that should obviously be expected from a person in a helping field such as counseling. Some of these examples are, well, pretty obvious, such as avoiding referring to people using slang or slurs. Another example is to avoid words that have long become associated more with insults than with technical or clinical labels, such as the word retarded. In and of themselves, I have no problem with avoiding the use of words like this. After all, I'm not campaigning that I should be able to throw around whatever language I want in professional papers. The issue I take in particular is when we start confusing legitimate professionalism with nitpicking. In this reading, there's an exercise that involves examining the differences between problematic and non-problematic ways of referring to various groups or individuals, and mixed in with several of the sensible and even painfully obvious words and phrases to avoid are more insidious and inexplicable examples. A sensible example: use the descriptive phrase First Nations peoples or Native Americans rather than Indians, because obviously the use of the word Indian to describe these individuals was born of a mistaken assumption in the first place. A painfully obvious example, and I have to post a picture of this here because I don't think any of you will believe it's listed as an example if I don't. The problematic example is, there is a new wave of boat people. And I'm pretty sure that many people will have no idea what this is referring to because I certainly didn't. Google helped explain it to me. It's referring to people seeking refuge after the Vietnam War. The preferred example they immediately list afterwards is, there is a new wave of individuals from Vietnam seeking refugee status. Now, you see what I mean when I say this example is painfully obvious to avoid? Why would anyone choose to say boat people rather than Vietnam refugees? It comes across as obviously patronizing for one thing, but for another, it's an outdated and unclear phrase which could also topically refer to folks migrating into Europe as well. Though it shouldn't, because, again, patronizing and unclear. So these examples I have no problems with, but then they're mixed in with things like this. Do not use male pronouns as inclusive of all human beings, with the examples, we might once again put a man on the moon, as contrasted with, human beings might once again walk on the moon. This is just being needlessly oversensitive, as the use of the word man in this way is usually drawn from the word human, not from males. Or how about, we should not use the term homosexual, but rather gay men and lesbians. Brief pause to let that one sink in. They offer an explanation for this on a separate page, but it's basically nonsensical and it will fit much better in my second point. To wrap this first segment up, I would like to reiterate that there is a difference between being professional, courteous, and sensitive in our use of language, and in combing through every possible negative interpretation of words and taking extreme measures to avoid their ever use simply at the risk of offending someone. This is basically the next point I'd like to talk about, so I'll lead straight into it. Number 2, making language cumbersome just for the sake of feels. I feel like it'll be easiest to start this segment by reading a few segments from the aforementioned explanations on why we should all of a sudden avoid the use of the term homosexual in professional writing. Language may be ambiguous in reference, so that the reader is uncertain about its meaning or its inclusion and exclusion criteria, and the term homosexuality has been associated in the past with deviance, mental illness, and criminal behavior, and these negative stereotypes may be perpetuated by biased language. The terms lesbian sexual orientation, heterosexual sexual orientation, gay male sexual orientation, and bisexual sexual orientation are preferable to lesbianism, heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. The former terms focus on people, and some of the latter terms have in the past been associated with pathology. The terms lesbian and gay men are preferred to homosexuals used as nouns when referring to specific persons or groups. The word homosexual has several problems of designation. First, it may perpetuate negative stereotypes because of its historical associations with pathology and criminal behavior. Second, it is ambiguous in reference because it is often assumed to refer exclusively to men and thus renders lesbians invisible. Third, it is often unclear. The terms gay male and lesbian refer primarily to identities and to the modern culture and communities that have developed among people who share these identities. They should be distinguished from sexual behavior. Some men and women have sex with others of their own gender but do not consider themselves to be gay or lesbian. In contrast, the terms heterosexual and bisexual currently are used to describe both identity and behavior. I think you guys get the point. I'll link the full page if you're so inclined to check out the rest of the page this comes from. This is from the official APA page, so it's not like I'm just pulling this out of nowhere, and that's part of the problem. There is a lot to unpack from this passage, but I'm going to try to stick to my specific point because I'm pretty sure the veritable mountain of assumptions they make more or less stand on their own absurdity. Homosexual is a clinical term, like heterosexual. I really don't feel like the term is as ambiguous as this article is leading people to believe, nor do I agree that the term has been misused any more than the term gay has been misused. How many times have you guys heard the term gay used as a pejorative to refer to something as stupid, lame, or unfair? Similarly, I've heard lesbo, les, and yes, even just plain old lesbian used as an insult as well. Fortunately, most of this occurred in high school, and most of the people who seriously use these terms in a negative way have all come around to be very accepting of LGBT individuals in their adult years, but my point still stands. That we should avoid using the term homosexual because it's been used in a pejorative way in the past doesn't fly considering the examples I've used involving their suggested substitutes. Furthermore, they're not even consistent in their use of these terms in this politically correct minefield either. After all, they go on to further clarify that lesbian sexual orientation is preferable to lesbianism. Quite frankly, as someone who is not exactly straight as an arrow myself, trying to tell me that bisexual sexual orientation, talk about a mouthful, is in any way preferable, let alone more precise, concise, or even somehow less offensive when compared to simply bisexuality, is in itself offensive to my sense of brevity and language ideals. I know. That's clearly not the kind of offense we're seeking to avoid here, but just think about this for a moment. Let's say that I write a paper on bisexuality, and for the sake of argument, let's make that paper 100 pages long with the word bisexual or bisexuality appearing 10 times on each page. Now you ask me to replace these simple single words with the much more awkward and cumbersome bisexual persons or bisexual sexual orientation, and you're adding anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 additional words over the course of the paper that do nothing other than add cruft without substance. All this in the name of not wanting to risk offending people. This is far from being the only example of this kind of thing, but I think this basically illustrates the problem. As much as they like to argue that their proposed changes add clarity and reduce the risk of perpetuating negative stereotypes, I would argue that the phrase homosexual males and females, or even men and women, is equally clear and arguably more professional in appearance than gay men and lesbians, and that when these phrases are taken by themselves, it is certainly no more likely to perpetuate a negative stereotype, which brings me to my last point. Number 3, intent matters. This is basically the simple reason why I think that all of this linguistic navel-gazing is a giant misguided waste of time. Some words are genuinely mean-spirited and intentionally offensive, and these words obviously have no place in a piece of professional writing. However, I honestly think that most people entering this level of education are not seeking to insult or belittle people. Most people in my position are aware of certain levels of sensitivity, such as avoiding the use of long since altered and now insensitive phrases such as idiot or retard in favor of words such as mentally handicapped or disabled, for example. However, many of these pages I'm going over are not referring to obvious things like this, and instead are needlessly complicating language in order to attempt to either A. eliminate even the slightest possibility that someone could be offended by something, B. waste time and energy trying to make themselves seem as progressive as possible, or C. all two of these options. Getting our knickers in a twist over trying to argue whether we ought to use disabled person versus person with a disability, or homosexuals versus lesbians and gay men, does not come across as a legitimate concern for people's sensibilities. It comes across as making things more difficult for the sake of feels. And changing things based on feels is never going to work because someone can always be offended by something, which is why I argue that the intent behind the words we use should be treated as the paramount issue, not whether the specific words we're using are sufficiently PC. Just to emphasize my point one last time, let's look at a few examples. 50 heterosexual couples and 50 homosexual couples participated in the interview. Ugh, you painted the outside of your house pink? You're such a homosexual. Or 70 lesbian women answered questions related to their career history. Did you catch Jenny peeking at the other girls in the change room? She's totally a lesbian. You see how both the supposedly correct words and the incorrect words can both be used in neutral and insulting ways? These words in themselves are not more or less offensive than each other. Their meanings are augmented depending on the context in which they're used. Trying to pretend like one word is inherently inferior because it was at one time used in a demeaning way by some people is just a losing game because it never ends. If we just focus on how these words are being used in proper context, I think we'll find that we get a lot more done, fill our research papers with fewer unnecessary qualifiers, and waste less time worrying about whether we might be coming across the wrong way. Anyway, I think I'm going to leave it at this. This actually wound up being a lot heftier of a rant than I originally expected from less than a single page of my first textbook. I have a feeling I'm going to be having plenty to talk about over the next couple of years. I'll try not to leave too large of gaps between videos, but with school, volunteering, and the odd job all popping up together in close proximity, it makes things a little erratic. Despite this, things are going well, and I'm excited about a lot of things that are coming up pretty quick here. I'd also like to give a brief shout out to everyone that I got to see at the She for He event last weekend. It was a really great event, and I'm so happy that it seemed to go off without a hitch. As for everyone else, as always, I really appreciate your support, and I hope to see you all in the future.